The flight deck of HMS Ark Royal was nearly vertical. A Force 9 gale was driving massive swells across the North Atlantic on the evening of 26 May 1941, and the carrier was rolling so severely that mechanics had to physically brace aircraft from sliding sideways off the deck. Green water broke over the bow. The ship pitched 15 degrees each way in the troughs, and the deck crews, soaked, bracing against safety rails, shouting over wind that made normal speech impossible, were trying to arm and fuel 15 biplanes in the dark. Each aircraft carried a single torpedo slung beneath its belly, an 18-inch Mark XII, 702 kilograms of steel and TNT. At 1910, those 15 aircraft stood on that pitching surface, engines turning, crews strapped in, waiting for the deck to roll back to something approaching level so they could launch without sliding into the sea. Some of the men watching them go thought it was lunacy. Somewhere ahead in the dark, the Bismarck was running for France. She had been at sea for 8 days, and she was close. Saint-Nazaire was roughly 700 miles distant, close enough to come under Luftwaffe fighter cover by morning, close enough for U-boats to escort her the rest of the way in. Once she arrived, she would be untouchable. The British knew it. Force H, operating out of Gibraltar, was the only force with any chance of intercepting her before she made port. Force H meant HMS Ark Royal. Ark Royal meant those 15 biplanes now disappearing into the storm. This is the story of why an aircraft that had no business surviving that approach not only survived it, but delivered the one hit that decided the fate of the most powerful warship Germany ever commissioned. The answer lies in an engineering irony so precise it almost seems deliberate. The Bismarck was so advanced, so thoroughly calibrated for the threats of her era, that she had almost no defense against something from a previous era entirely. Her greatest technological strength became a specific liability, and a canvas and steel relic exploited that liability with one torpedo. Her keel was laid at Blohm and Voss in Hamburg on July 1st, 1936. She was launched on February 14, 1939, with Hitler addressing an audience of 60,000, commissioned in August 1940. Standard displacement was 41,700 tons, at full load over 50,000. She was 251 meters long, capable of 30 knots, and armed with 8 38-centimeter guns in 4 twin turrets named Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, capable of firing 1,800-pound shells to ranges beyond 36,000 meters. The main armored belt measured 320 millimeters. Her fire control was built around the C/38K electromechanical analog computer, processing targeting data from multiple rangefinder stations, including a 10.5-meter base instrument in the foretop, and forwarding firing solutions directly to the gun mounts without manual intervention. 3 Fumo 23 radar sets gave her detection range of approximately 25,000 meters. Her designers had fitted her with a special anti-torpedo belt of nickel-chrome steel they believed no British torpedo then in service could reliably penetrate. The British Admiralty watched her with something between alarm and obsession. In May 1941, 16 Atlantic convoys were at sea simultaneously: food, munitions, oil, troops. The Bismarck didn't need to defeat the Royal Navy. She just needed to reach the convoys. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commanding the Home Fleet from King George V, knew that stopping her wasn't optional. Then Hood went down. On 24 May 1941, in the Denmark Strait, the Bismarck and HMS Hood met for the first time and the only time. Hood was 48,360 tons fully loaded, 8 15-inch guns, the embodiment of British naval power for 2 decades. She had sacrificed armour for speed. That had been the design logic of her class, built in the final years of the First World War. And it turned out to matter enormously. HMS Suffolk first sighted the Bismarck through mist at 1922 on the 23rd, and the British tracked her through the night as both sides manoeuvred into position. The actual engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. A salvo from the Bismarck penetrated Hood's magazine, and then a reporter aboard a nearby destroyer described seeing a flame erupt between Hood's 2 funnels that went 1,000 feet into the sky, burned briefly, and went out. Then a cloud of smoke settled where the ship had been. Of Hood's 1,419 men, 3 were pulled from the water alive. Churchill directed every available warship in the Atlantic toward the Bismarck. 4 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, 3 heavy cruisers, 10 light cruisers, 21 destroyers. The Bismarck damaged Prince of Wales in the same action and broke contact in the early hours of 25th May. For 31 hours, the Royal Navy didn't know where she was. A navigation error aboard the Bismarck led to a long radio transmission that gave the British a rough position fix, heading southeast toward France. A Catalina flying boat spotted her at approximately 10:30 on 26th May. By then, the window was almost closed. Ark Royal's aircraft were the last option standing between the Bismarck and safety. The Fairey Swordfish entered Royal Navy service in 1936, the same year Bismarck's keel was laid, and the Fleet Air Arm's own journals had noted, with a certain institutional honesty, that the Walrus, Swordfish and Skua were the slowest aircraft of their respective types in the world. By 1941, the aircraft was sharing the same war as machines from a different technological generation entirely. The American Grumman TBF Avenger, entering production that year, had a top speed of 271 miles per hour. A contemporary Spitfire cruised above 350. The Swordfish, in clean configuration and at altitude, managed between 138 and 143 miles per hour. On a torpedo attack run, carrying the 1,548-pound Mark XII, maintaining a straight and level approach at 50 feet above the wave tops, crews had been trained at the Royal Naval Air Station at Crail to drop at between 103 and 115 miles per hour. At the low end of that range, the Swordfish was slower than a pre-war racing car. The construction reflected the design era. Steel spar wings, steel tube fuselage, fabric covering. Bristol Pegasus radial engine, 690 horsepower. Open cockpit, no canopy, no windscreen worth speaking of, the pilot and observer exposed to whatever the weather was doing. Fixed undercarriage. The wheels hung permanently beneath the fuselage and never retracted, a permanent aerodynamic drag penalty that no fighter pilot would have accepted. 3 crew. The pilot up front, the observer directly behind with the course and speed calculator and the torpedo release control, the telegraphist, air gunner, further aft with a Lewis gun in a ring mount. The Lewis gun was almost useless against modern fighters, but the Swordfish wasn't built for that kind of engagement. The Fleet Air Arm had nicknamed it the String Bag, a reference to the popular string shopping bags of the era that could accommodate almost anything you stuffed into them. The Swordfish could carry torpedoes, bombs, mines, depth charges, or rockets depending on the mission. Crews were attached to it the way working mechanics are attached to a tool that's old and unglamorous but never fails at the critical moment. Some of this attachment was earned. On November 11, 1940, 6 months before the Bismarck attack, 21 Swordfish from HMS Illustrious had conducted the first all-aircraft naval attack in history against the Italian fleet anchored at Taranto. damaged or sunk 3 battleships, 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers in a single night at a cost of 2 aircraft. Against warships caught in harbour, the slow and low approach was devastatingly suited to the work. The North Atlantic in a Force 9 gale was something different. Earlier, on 26th May, Ark Royal had already launched a first strike and very nearly produced a catastrophe. The afternoon attack had been armed with magnetic pistols, a newer design of detonator that in theory would trigger beneath a ship's hull, exploiting the concentrated magnetic field at the keel for a more structurally devastating detonation than a simple side impact. The problem was that in the violent swells of the North Atlantic, the magnetic field of the wave crests themselves, combined with metallic sources in the water, was triggering the detonators prematurely. The strike crews descended through cloud into attack position and found HMS Sheffield below them. The cruiser had been quietly detached earlier in the day to shadow the Bismarck from a distance, and nobody had passed that information to the pilots. 11 torpedoes were dropped. Several detonated immediately on entering the water, triggered by nothing. Sheffield threw her helm hard over and twisted between the ones that ran. One torpedo passed so close that a Sheffield sailor later said he could have leaned over the rail and touched it. The cruiser took no casualties and signalled the returning Swordfish with something between relief and fury. Back on Ark Royal, the maintenance crews worked fast. The magnetic pistols came off all 15 weapons in the evening strike. Standard contact detonators went on. If the warhead physically strikes something, it detonates. Simple, reliable, tested for decades. The torpedoes were rechecked, the aircraft were fueled, and at 1910, in conditions that should by rights have prevented any flying at all, the Swordfish went off the deck, one by one, into the North Atlantic darkness. The deck handlers remember it in fragments in the accounts that survive. The carrier's bows driving into a swell and coming up streaming water. The aircraft straining at their chocks. The deck officer watching the angle of the flight deck and timing the launch flag for the moment the bow came back up, because launching into the roll could flip an aircraft into the sea before it had flying speed. 15 launches, one at a time, into a Force 9. Every single one got airborne. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat was 21 years old. He had been born in the Scottish borders on the 17th of June 1919, commissioned into the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, trained as a pilot at Eastleigh near Southampton, and assigned to 818 Naval Air Squadron in the autumn of 1940. His father had served in the Royal Navy before him, including aboard an earlier ship named Ark Royal, so there was a family symmetry to where he'd ended up. By the evening of 26th May 1941, he had been flying Swordfish operationally for 7 months. His aircraft that evening was 5C/L9726. His observer was Sub-Lieutenant J.D. Dusty Miller. His telegraphist air gunner was leading aircraftman A.J. Hayman. The three of them were in open cockpits in a Force 9 gale, somewhere between the cloud base and 50 feet above the Atlantic in the dark, looking for a battleship that was shooting back. Miller's job at the moment of the attack was to lean out over the side of the aircraft while it was in the final seconds of the attack run, fully exposed to the slipstream and the spray, and use a sight to judge the angle between the Swordfish's heading and the Bismarck's course. From that, with the course and speed calculator, he worked out the required aim-off point and called the release. He had maybe 3 or 4 seconds between a usable sighting angle and the aircraft passing the optimum drop position. The approach to the Bismarck looked nothing like a training exercise at Crail. The Bismarck was shooting with everything she had. Her main battery was firing in the direction of the attacking aircraft, Not because 38-centimeter guns are effective anti-aircraft weapons, but because the concussive blasts from salvos in the path of incoming aircraft were enough to destroy a light aircraft outright, or throw it off its attack run. The 10.5-centimeter guns were firing through their centralized fire control directors, producing a wall of exploding shells ahead of the attackers. The 3.7-centimeter and 2-centimeter crews were working their weapons manually in the pitching dark. Moffett pushed the Swordfish down through the cloud and levelled out 50 feet above the waves. As we dived through the murk into a lethal storm of shells and bullets, he wrote later, Bismarck's guns erupted, and in the hail of hot bullets and tracer, I couldn't see any of the other Swordfish. I thought the closer we were to the water, the better chance we had of surviving, so we flew in, bouncing off the tops of the waves, and it worked. The great thing about the Swordfish was that the bullets just went straight through. After all, it was only made of canvas. It was like David and Goliath. Behind him, Miller was leaning out into the slipstream, working the angle, watching the Bismarck's silhouette against the tracer-lit sky, calling adjustments. Not yet, not yet. Then, let her go. The exact attribution of the fatal hit has never been definitively settled, and Moffett himself was consistent and careful about saying so. He insisted that in the confusion and poor visibility, it was impossible to know whose torpedo had found the stern, that the attack was a collective effort, that the German battleship had been sunk by the Royal Navy as a whole, rather than by one man in one aircraft. Historian Mike Rossiter, analysing the attack geometries from the available records, concluded Moffett was by far the most likely candidate. A 2002 Daily Telegraph investigation attributed the hit to either Lieutenant David Godfrey Fawcett or Sub-Lieutenant Kenneth Pattison. The wreck evidence, showing a torpedo hole in the starboard steering compartment, complicates Moffett's candidacy further. He attacked from the port side. The Navy Wing's charity, drawing on Royal Navy operational records, describes him as widely credited, which is the most the evidence honestly supports. What the record confirms without dispute is simpler. One torpedo from one aircraft in that attack found the Bismarck's stern. The popular account of why the Swordfish survived collapses into a single sentence. The guns couldn't track something that slow. That is correct, but the mechanism behind it specific enough to be worth understanding, because it's the mechanism that makes the whole story work. The Bismarck's heavy anti-aircraft battery consisted of 16 10.5-centimeter guns in 8 twin mounts. These were directed by 4 SL-8 fire control posts, each with 4-meter rangefinders, feeding data into the C/38K computer, which generated targeting solutions and transmitted them directly to the gun mounts. For the medium battery, 16 3.7-centimeter guns, and the close-range battery of 22-centimeter weapons, there was no centralized fire control at all. Those guns used manual aim. Anti-aircraft predictor systems operate on a simple premise with a demanding execution. You can't aim at where an aircraft currently is. By the time your shell travels several kilometers through the aircraft has moved substantially. The predictor takes the target's range, bearing, speed, altitude, and heading, runs those inputs through its calculation mechanism, and outputs where the aircraft will be when the shell arrives. The gun then aims at that future position. The accuracy of the entire system depends entirely on one thing: the accuracy of the speed input. Feed in the wrong speed, and every firing solution is wrong in a consistent, predictable direction. You fire at a point in space the aircraft never actually occupies. The Bismarck's predictor had been calibrated during sea trials between February and April 1941, using Heinkel HE-111 bombers as aerial targets. The artillery testing report, later translated from the German, contains a significant complaint buried in its anti-aircraft section. The Stuka target aircraft used for practice exercises were criticized for being unrealistic because they dropped and dived much too slowly. The implication is direct. The Bismarck's gunnery training regime had been built around targets moving at speeds appropriate to modern fast aircraft. The predictors had been calibrated, the crews drilled, the tactical procedures established, all on the assumption that attacking aircraft would be fast, because in 1941 attacking aircraft were fast. A swordfish on a torpedo approach, flying at roughly 100 miles per hour, was a targeting problem the system had simply never been asked to solve. When the sea/38K calculated a lead angle for a target at that speed, it came out too large. Shells consistently arrived at a point in space the swordfish had already passed through. Every round missed in the same direction, for the same systematic reason. The lighter guns had a different problem. Without a centralized predictor, a 3.7 centimeter gunner was aiming manually by instinct and training. Manual deflection shooting against a slow-moving target is genuinely counterintuitive. Human gunnery instinct, sharpened on fast-moving objects, applies too much lead. The brain calculates a deflection appropriate for something doing 300 miles per hour and applies it to something doing 100. Add to this a pitching ship in violent force 9 swells, aircraft flying so low that the physical depression limits on several of the gun mounts made engagement at close range nearly impossible. Dense smoke and tracer from Bismarck's own guns cutting visibility across the deck, and crews who had never in their training encountered a biplane torpedo bomber at all. Navy Wings UK, the Royal Navy's official aviation charity, states it without qualification. The Swordfish flew so slowly that Bismarck's fire control couldn't calculate the AA guns. A book account of the engagement notes that the Bismarck's gunners found it extremely tricky to hit the attackers, specifically because the aircraft were flying slower than the systems had been built to handle. 15 aircraft attacked. Not one was shot down by anti-aircraft fire from the Bismarck. One Swordfish was damaged, took hits, force-landed in the sea on the return, and its crew was rescued. The most sophisticated, layered anti-aircraft defense on any ship in the German fleet, in 16 10.5 centimeter guns with centralized fire control, 16 3.7 centimeter guns, and 22 centimeter weapons, fired enormous quantities of ammunition against 15 aircraft made of fabric and destroyed none of them. The first hit from the evening strike was amidships against the armoured belt. 320 millimetres of hardened steel did exactly what it was designed to do: minor flooding. The Bismarck's engineering staff noted it, reported it, and carried on. The armour had worked. The second torpedo hit the stern. The Bismarck's designers had acknowledged in their own documentation that the stern was weakly constructed. The main citadel, the section of hull containing the magazines, boilers, engines and primary machinery, was built to withstand direct fire from other capital ships. The steering gear existed outside the full protection of the citadel. The rudder posts, the steering motors, the shafting, the compartment where the crew actually operated the ship's steering, comparatively lightly armoured, because armour that could cover every square metre of a 50,000-ton ship didn't exist without making the ship too heavy to move. The Mark XII torpedo, carrying approximately 176 kilograms of TNT, didn't fight its way through the armour. It arrived at the part of the hull the armour wasn't adequately covering. The explosion was felt throughout the ship. Engineering crew nearest the stern reported a sharp concussive blow transmitted through the hull. Then the immediate sensation of flooding. water entering the stern compartments fast, under pressure from multiple ruptures simultaneously. The rudder angle indicator on the bridge registered a reading that technical analysis conducted decades later on the wreck concluded almost certainly reflected a damaged indicator rather than the actual mechanical position of the rudders. In reality, the starboard rudder had been structurally destroyed, at no particular angle, simply wrecked. The port rudder was likely worse. The steering compartment flooded immediately and completely. The engineering officers were down there within minutes. What they found was a compartment fully inundated, the water rising and surging with each pitch of the ship in the Force 9 swells. The structural damage severe enough to make any repair attempt in field essentially impossible. They reported to the bridge. Divers were prepared and sent down through the night. Men descending into a flooded compartment inside a ship rolling in heavy seas, working by feel in complete darkness, trying to assess whether the rudder posts could be freed or whether the damage was beyond any improvised remedy. The surging water, driven by the swell motion of the hull, made it impossible to hold position or apply force in a controlled direction. Every attempt failed. By midnight, the engineering staff had concluded what they already suspected. Without a dry dock, the rudders weren't coming back. The Bismarck then attempted to steer through differential propeller thrust, varying the revolution rate of the port and starboard outer shafts to create a turning moment through asymmetric thrust. It's a technique that works on some ships, particularly those with 4 propeller shafts. Robert Ballard, examining the wreck in 1989 and studying the ship's design specifications, identified precisely why it hadn't worked here. Bismarck had been designed with 3 propeller shafts, not 4, a weight-saving decision that had been flagged during sea trials as a handling limitation, recorded in the design documentation and never corrected because no practical correction was available. A centre shaft and 2 outer shafts, once the rudders were gone, gave the crew far less directional authority than a 4-shaft arrangement would have. They could slow one side and accelerate the other, but the manoeuvre was crude and imprecise, and the result wasn't a controlled course toward France. The Bismarck circled. She drifted northwest, away from Saint-Nazaire, toward the waiting British fleet. She was heading deeper into trouble with every hour she couldn't steer. Admiral Lutyens sent a signal to Fleet Command. The Bismarck would fight to the last round. On the bridge, Captain Lindemann is reported to have made the same determination. The ship wasn't going anywhere. The crew knew it. 2,000 men aboard a ship that had been reduced by 1 torpedo from 1 biplane in a storm, from the most feared warship in the Atlantic to a stationary target. At 8:47 on the morning of 27th May 1941, HMS Rodney and HMS King George V found her and opened fire from the northwest. The Bismarck's turrets were still operational, still rotating, still tracking the incoming British ships. She returned fire. For a short time, the battle had the superficial appearance of an equal exchange between capital ships. Then, British fire found the Bismarck's command positions. Her fire control directors went silent, one after another. Anton and Bruno, the 2 forward turrets, continued firing after the bridge was destroyed, their crews working on local control. As the range closed inside 10,000 meters, Rodney's 16-inch shells were arriving at steep enough angles to begin defeating armor that had been designed to deflect fire at longer battle ranges. Rodney fired 719 rounds of heavy ammunition during the engagement. The cruisers, HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire, added their guns to the bombardment. For approximately 74 minutes, British ships systematically destroyed everything above the Bismarck's waterline. The secondary batteries, the 3.7 centimetre mounts, the superstructure, the rangefinder positions, reduced to burning wreckage, compartment by compartment. The main turrets fell silent as the gun directors controlling them were eliminated, the trained crews inside killed, or the communication systems destroyed. By late in the engagement, the Bismarck was on fire along most of her length, listing, clearly sinking, but slowly. Remarkably, stubbornly slowly. The physical examination of the wreck by Ballard's expedition confirmed what the engineering analysis had suggested for 50 years. The main armoured citadel had been penetrated only 4 times through its full vertical thickness during the entire final bombardment. The armour had functioned as designed. The Bismarck's hull wasn't being shot open from the sides. She was being destroyed from the top down, from the superstructure inward. The British could kill her crew and silence her weapons. Actually sinking her through gunfire alone against the intact citadel armour was proving slow. The debate over whether the Bismarck was ultimately finished by British shells or by her own crew has run in the naval history literature since 1941. The evidence from the wreck and from survivor testimony suggests both. The crew appears to have opened seacocks and prepared scuttling charges as the ship became inoperable, a standard naval protocol to prevent a warship from being captured. The majority of experts conclude that scuttling hastened the inevitable foundering. The ship would have sunk from the accumulated damage eventually, but the crew's actions accelerated it. At approximately 10:36, Dorsetshire fired her torpedoes into the port side. At approximately 10:40, the Bismarck rolled onto her side and sank at 48 degrees 10 minutes north, 16 degrees 12 minutes west. Of approximately 2,200 men aboard, 116 were rescued. Around 800 were in the water when the rescue ships arrived. The ships withdrew when a U-boat was reported in the area, and most of the men still in the water died from exposure before rescue could reach them. The weight of fire required to complete that sinking, 2 battleships and 2 cruisers, 74 minutes, hundreds of heavy caliber shells, stands directly against what had actually decided the outcome the night before. The armour had worked. The citadel had held through 4 days of being hunted across the Atlantic. What had failed was the one system that existed outside the armour's protection, in the weakly armoured stern, the steering gear. Destroyed by one torpedo from a biplane that the Bismarck's own anti-aircraft systems had been fundamentally miscalibrated to engage. On the 8th of June 1989, Robert Ballard located the wreck at approximately 4,800 metres depth. The stern section had separated from the main hull during the descent and rested some distance away. Examination of the damage to the stern compartments confirmed the catastrophic nature of the torpedo strike. The steering gear had been structurally destroyed, not merely jammed, and no in-field repair team working in those conditions could have freed it. The armoured citadel, as the wreck showed, was largely intact, testament to the quality of the German armour engineering. The part of the ship that had ended the Bismarck wasn't the part the armour had been built to protect. John Moffat, widely credited for the torpedo that found the stern, though the exact attribution remains genuinely uncertain, became a commercial pilot after the war. He gave interviews about the attack across several decades. The same story, the same honesty about what he couldn't know and wouldn't claim. He died on the 11th of December 2016, aged 97, the last surviving member of the strike crews. He never claimed more than his share of what happened that night, and he returned consistently to the same image. It was like David and Goliath. He meant it as a description of proportion. A canvas biplane against a 50,000-ton battleship. What he was also describing, without framing it in engineering terms, was the precise mechanism by which the smaller machine won. The Bismarck's fire control was genuinely sophisticated. Her radar was genuinely capable. Her armour was genuinely formidable. The C/38K computer, the SL-8 directors, the layered anti-aircraft batteries, all of it designed, calibrated and tested against the threats that naval doctrine in the late 1930s predicted a fast modern battleship would face. Fast monoplane torpedo bombers, modern dive bombers, aircraft capable of the speeds the predictors were built to calculate. The sea trials had used HE-111 bombers. The testing report had complained that even the Stuka practice targets moved too slowly to be realistic. Nobody had asked the system to track a biplane from 1936 on a torpedo approach at 100 miles per hour across wave tops in a North Atlantic storm, because nobody building the Bismarck in 1936 had seriously expected to encounter one. What came out of the cloud cover at 21:05 on 26th of May 1941 was something the Bismarck's entire defensive architecture had no reliable answer for. Not because the answer hadn't been engineered, but because the question hadn't been anticipated. The lead angle came out wrong. The lighter guns overled. The ship pitched in the gale. The aircraft flew too low for some batteries to depress onto, and the bullets went straight through the canvas. It took 2 battleships and 2 cruisers firing for over an hour to sink her. It took 1 torpedo to ensure she could never escape. The most feared warship on Earth wasn't defeated by something greater than itself. It was defeated by something its systems had never been asked to account for. Something so old, so slow, so thoroughly beneath the notice of a ship engineered for the future of naval warfare, that the machinery built to protect her had no calibration for it at all. The Bismarck was so advanced, she was vulnerable to the past. Subscribe for more stories like this.